Peter III was not born as a long-awaited child but as a political necessity, and from his earliest years his life followed a straight line of cold supervision, shifting hands of nannies and tutors, and strict orders instead of warm words. He quickly grew used to a world where order mattered more than feeling, and silent obedience was valued above understanding. His only space of control was a small army of wooden toy soldiers that always stood straight, obeyed without protest, and never turned away. In those long hours of arranging ranks, inventing names, and issuing commands, he built a sense of power that replaced the affection he never received. When the adolescent was brought to Russia, the court met the foreigner with caution. His speech carried an accent, his manners irritated, his jokes seemed crude, and his gestures awkward. Courtiers laughed behind his back, ministers looked on with disdain, and his future wife, Catherine, saw in him a man incapable of simple conversation. That constant strangeness turned him inward, and resentment grew together with a need to control anyone who came close. By the time he reached the throne, that need had hardened into habit. Meetings resembled drills, ministers had to stand straight and speak briefly, and any hesitation was treated as defiance. In the evenings he carried that same logic of subordination into his private chamber and made it tangible through a ritual with a cup. At first, it held a bitter mixture of wine, salt, wormwood, and vinegar that a courtier was required to drink without flinching or breaking eye contact. But soon the test turned into a humiliating game known among courtiers as the jester sessions, because under the lid of the cup there was more and more often not wine or herbs, but a thick, warm mass of his own excrement, brought in from the next room by order of the sovereign. He himself pointed to the lid and invited them to guess what was inside, and when guests exchanged glances, he ordered it to be opened. The stench struck immediately. Time slowed. He would call someone by name, set the cup before him, and calmly say that loyalty was measured not by words but by endurance. The person had to take a sip without showing disgust. To make the substance flow, it was mixed with wine. To make sure everyone heard, the servant stirred it with a spoon, and in that silence the wet sound became the center of the ritual. It marked the line between submission and refusal. Then came the emperor's short laugh and his customary reward for those who endured, a small token of favor, the right to approach more freely, a place closer to the table. Those who failed disappeared from the schedule for weeks or forever, because to empower meant forcing a man to swallow disgust and still keep his face. Only that act, performed before others, seemed to him a true oath. The ritual soon became the court's routine. Servants knew the order of actions, when to bring the clean cup, when the warm one, when to pour the wine. They knew the emperor was watching not the contents but the faces, and the calmer the face, the higher the rank. Over time the chamber formed its own hierarchy where skill and experience meant less than the ability to endure humiliation. Those who had dignity withdrew, others competed to show composure. The scene filled with the same smiles, the same rigid backs, and the same readiness to obey any gesture, because in that system, endurance was the only proof of loyalty. He did not think of it as cruelty or evil. He explained it as a necessity of living among people he could not trust, convincing himself that order protected him from chaos and that humiliation kept the court safe. In later memoirs, faint references to these evenings would surface, but after his overthrow Catherine ordered all records of the jester sessions destroyed, for they revealed too clearly how humiliation had become the language of power. For Peter himself, it was only a continuation of his childhood, the world finally standing quiet and obedient, like the toy soldiers that had once listened to him without question. The empire he inherited soon began to mirror the same logic that ruled his private chamber, and what had once been a strange personal ritual quietly spread across the entire court, turning humiliation into routine. Each evening the reception hall filled with people who tried to look cheerful but watched every gesture in fear. The silver cup stood at the center of the table, its lid glinting in candlelight, and servants repeated the same sequence as if performing a sacred ceremony. They poured the wine, stirred the mixture, and waited for the emperor's signal. Sometimes the liquid was only bitter and unpleasant, but at other times it contained his own excrement, and no one dared to guess which it would be. Peter called it a test of loyalty, a way to measure who could suppress disgust and obey without hesitation. When the name of the chosen courtier was announced, the man stepped forward, bowed, and accepted the cup with both hands, his eyes fixed on the emperor's face. The moment of silence before the sip became part of the ritual itself. Those who swallowed without reaction received the usual nod and a token of favor, while those who faltered vanished from view, their names erased from future lists. What had begun as grotesque curiosity now repeated night after night until it became a pattern, a rhythm that defined life at court. People competed to prove devotion, convincing themselves that endurance meant honor. Foreign diplomats described the scene in disbelief, sending letters that spoke of a ruler who turned filth into discipline and laughter into a weapon. Catherine, already distant from her husband, recorded his actions with precise calm, calling him weak-minded and unstable, a man whose thoughts had stopped developing long before he reached power. She understood that his obsession was not cruelty in the usual sense but a sickness built from fear and isolation. For Peter, control had replaced reason, and the ritual that once tested obedience had become the only form of order he trusted. As months passed, state affairs lost meaning. Ministers stopped bringing decisions to him, knowing that his attention faded almost immediately. The palace began to revolve entirely around his games. New courtiers learned quickly that silence was safer than honesty, and the sound of the spoon striking the cup became the signal that the evening had begun. One by one they drank, forcing smiles, hiding nausea, repeating the same gestures that the emperor mistook for loyalty. He believed that the world around him had finally reached perfection, still, obedient, and without resistance, but the silence that surrounded him was not devotion. It was fear. Beneath that surface the order he valued so deeply was already breaking apart. Servants whispered behind the walls, guards mocked him out of sight, and those who once drank out of duty now did it out of desperation. The empire still functioned, but the man at its center lived inside a theater that existed only for him. Every evening the same room filled with the same forced laughter, the same trembling hands, and the same cup placed carefully on the table, warm, heavy, and waiting for the next name to be called. The quiet fear that filled the palace soon became the only language left between the emperor and those who served him. The ritual with the cup no longer shocked anyone. It had become a symbol of power so deeply woven into court life that even those who despised it dared not speak. Peter believed he had created a perfect system, one where loyalty could be proven through silence and disgust could be disguised as discipline. Each evening followed the same rhythm, the candles lit, the chairs aligned, the faces frozen into practiced smiles. The spoon touched the edge of the cup, and the room fell still. It was the sound that reminded everyone that obedience was no longer a choice but a condition of survival. Catherine watched all of it with the composure of someone who already understood the outcome. She did not argue, she did not plead, she observed. In her private notes, written in cold, factual sentences, she called him unfit to rule and incapable of thought. Foreign envoys began to record the same impression. Reports from the Prussian and French embassies described a man consumed by paranoia and childish cruelty, surrounded by flatterers who mimicked his every move. The empire continued to operate on paper, but in reality, decisions were made by secretaries and generals while the emperor remained locked inside his private cycle of humiliation and laughter. At dinners he forced his guests to speak only when spoken to. No one touched their food before he did. He watched for the smallest tremor in a hand, the faintest sign of hesitation, and any movement could be interpreted as defiance. Those who once dared to smile at his absurdities now smiled only when he smiled, laughed only when he laughed, and raised their cups only when he nodded. The court had turned into a mirror where every reflection belonged to him. The more absolute his control appeared, the less real it became. Outside the palace walls the army was restless, and the ministers who avoided his presence began to build quiet alliances. Inside, the atmosphere thickened with fear. The rituals were repeated so often that they lost even the illusion of meaning. People no longer pretended to be loyal, they performed loyalty like a routine. Each motion was precise, practiced, mechanical. The emperor mistook that numb perfection for stability, believing that he had finally achieved harmony between authority and obedience. By that time, Catherine had already begun to act. Her confidence grew as his isolation deepened. Officers from the guard visited her in secret, swearing allegiance with quiet conviction. Letters to foreign courts were written in code and carried out of the city by trusted servants. Everyone understood that the empire could not survive much longer under a ruler whose mind had broken beneath the weight of his own rituals. Yet inside the palace nothing changed. The laughter continued, the spoons clinked against metal, and the same cup was placed on the same table night after night, its contents unchanged, its purpose forgotten. For Peter, that world felt safe. It was silent, predictable, and filled with faces that never contradicted him. He did not see that every smile was hollow and every nod rehearsed. In his mind, he was surrounded by loyal subjects who shared his vision of order. In truth, he was alone, standing in the middle of a performance that existed only because no one dared to end it. And as Catherine's allies gathered their strength, the emperor remained where he had always been, inside the echo of his own commands, waiting for the next evening, when the same faces would appear, and the same ritual would begin again. The order that had once seemed unshakable began to dissolve quietly, without noise or open defiance. The same corridors that had echoed with laughter now carried only murmurs and footsteps. Servants still performed the rituals, but their movements had become empty. They stirred the cup, they bowed, they smiled, yet their eyes no longer hid fear, only fatigue. The emperor did not notice the change. He still believed that his rules worked, that his court remained disciplined and loyal. In truth, it was an imitation of obedience, a fragile theater that survived only because everyone knew it would soon end. The ceremonies lost their tension. Courtiers no longer trembled as they once did, some even exchanged quick glances when the lid was lifted. There were nights when Peter ordered the ritual and no one came forward. He would wait, confused, calling names from memory, and the silence of the room pressed back against him. The servants obeyed his gestures but avoided his eyes. They had learned that the emperor's anger had turned into exhaustion. When the cup was placed before him, the mixture inside was no longer prepared by his command but by routine, without precision or care. The once sacred order of humiliation had decayed into repetition. Catherine's allies had already moved their pieces. Messages passed through the palace disguised as menus and invitations. Officers who once stood at his banquets now met in her chambers, speaking quietly of duty, not loyalty. Peter, unaware of how quickly his authority was evaporating, withdrew deeper into the same habits that had isolated him from the beginning. He spent hours inspecting meaningless documents, signing decrees no one would enforce, speaking to portraits as if they could still listen. The laughter that had once filled the hall now echoed only from him. One evening, determined to prove that he still commanded respect, he ordered the ceremony to be performed before the officers of his guard. The table was prepared, the cup polished, the candles lit, and he waited for the doors to open. But the hall remained empty. Minutes passed, then an hour. The emperor stood alone before the cup, surrounded by untouched food and melting wax. He called for the servants, but none came. For the first time he felt the silence as something alive, not the silence of discipline, but the silence of abandonment. That night, the palace slept while the guards marched elsewhere. Catherine's faction moved without resistance. By dawn the gates were open, and the emperor, who once demanded absolute control, stood surrounded by men who no longer saluted. There were no orders to give, no voices to command, and no ritual to restore the order that had already collapsed. The cup remained on the table, its surface still reflecting the candlelight, a perfect, empty symbol of a power that no longer existed. When they led him away, he did not protest. He believed, even then, that the game could continue somewhere else, that discipline could be rebuilt and obedience reclaimed. But the illusion had already dissolved. The empire was moving on without him, leaving behind only the echo of his voice and the smell of the room where for so long humiliation had passed as loyalty. After his removal from the throne, Peter III was sent away quietly, without ceremony or resistance. The courtiers who had once bowed before him vanished overnight, and the guards who escorted him were the same men who had laughed at his rituals in silence. He was taken to a distant residence outside the city, where the walls were bare and the corridors smelled of damp wood. There were no servants to perform the ceremonies, no polished tables, no silver cup. For the first time in his life, the world around him refused to follow his rhythm. At first, he tried to recreate it. He ordered chairs to be arranged in a line and waited for attendants who never arrived. He asked for the evening meal to be served in proper order, but no one understood what he meant. The only sound was the creaking of the floorboards and the slow dripping of water from the roof. He spoke to the guards as if they were courtiers, giving them instructions, calling them by the names of his former ministers. They nodded out of pity, not respect. Each day he lost more of the structure that had once defined his existence, and with it went the illusion that obedience could be controlled. Catherine received reports from the new guards, short notes written without sentiment. They described him as quiet, distracted, sometimes speaking to himself, sometimes laughing. He still believed that the empire was waiting, that the rituals could return, that the court would be rebuilt once his wife realized her mistake. She never answered, and she never visited. The order she issued was clear: no record of the jester sessions was to survive. Every document, every witness, every object tied to them was to be destroyed. The silver cup was melted down. The servants who had attended those nights were reassigned or dismissed. What remained of the ritual disappeared into rumor. But Europe remembered. Foreign diplomats had written their letters long before the purge, and those reports spread quickly across the continent. In Vienna, Berlin, and Paris, stories circulated about the Russian emperor who forced his courtiers to drink from a cup that held his own excrement, or ruler who mistook degradation for loyalty and madness for power. To some it sounded like an exaggeration, to others like a perfect symbol of absolute monarchy turned against itself. Peter never understood how completely the world had moved on. He died alone within months, officially from illness, though most records avoided the details. When the door of his room was opened, the table beside his bed was set with a wooden bowl and a cup half filled with water. The chairs were aligned in a perfect row, as if waiting for invisible guests. His hands rested on the table, palms flat, as though the ritual might begin again. In the end, the silence he had always desired finally surrounded him. The world stood still, just as he had wanted, and no one dared to move or speak. The toy army of his childhood had returned, quiet, obedient, and lifeless. And for the first time, the emperor who had demanded control over every breath could no longer command his own.